Don't move. Don't make a sound. If you walk through that door right now, you're a dead man. The maid, his maid, standing in the dark of his own kitchen. Both hands raised, voice barely a whisper, blocking the hallway, like her body alone could stop him. Maxwell Gray had a gun in his hand and 22 years of survival instinct telling him to push past her. But something in her eyes stopped him cold. Not fear, not desperation, certainty. The kind that only comes from someone who already knows exactly how the story ends and has decided at great personal risk to rewrite it. If this story already has your heart racing, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end, because I promise you what happens next will shake you to your core. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The meeting in New York had ended 3 hours early. That alone should have been a sign. In 22 years of running the most feared criminal organization east of the Mississippi, Maxwell Gray had never once left a meeting before it was finished. He didn't do early. He didn't do unplanned. Every move he made was calculated, deliberate, final. His enemies feared him not because he was violent, though God knows he was, but because he was predictable in the most terrifying way. When Maxwell Gray made a decision, it stayed made. But tonight, something had gotten under his skin. Something he couldn't name. It started small, a feeling low and persistent, like a note played just slightly off key. During the summit with the Marchetti family, while his lawyer was laying out the terms of a waterfront deal that would have made them all rich beyond reason, Maxwell had found himself distracted. His eyes kept drifting to his phone. His mind kept pulling toward home. He'd brushed it off twice, chalked it up to fatigue. He hadn't slept well in 3 days. Then Vincent Marchetti, old Vincent, 74 years old, half blind, but sharp as a razor, had leaned across the table and looked at him in a way that made Maxwell's blood run cold. "You should go home, Max," Vincent had said quietly. Not as advice, more like a statement of fact, like a man reading weather from a sky nobody else could see. Maxwell had stared at him. "What did you say?" "I said the deal can wait." Vincent leaned back. "Go home to your wife." Nobody spoke after that. The room sat in a silence so thick you could have cut it with a knife. And Maxwell had looked at Vincent for a long, hard moment. This old man who had buried 3 sons and outlasted 6 federal investigations and felt something cold crawl up the back of his neck. He was in his car 11 minutes later. The drive back to Chicago took 4.5 hours in the rain. Maxwell sat in the back of the Rolls-Royce Phantom jacket off collar, opened the Beretta resting on the seat beside him like an old companion. His driver, Santos, kept his eyes forward and his mouth shut. That was what Maxwell paid him for. Maxwell stared out at the darkness, scrolling past the window, and tried to organize the feeling gnawing at him into something rational. He ran through the list of his known enemies, a list that filled an imaginary ledger the size of a phone book. He thought about recent intelligence, about loose ends, about anyone who might have gotten bold enough or desperate enough to make a move. His mind kept circling back to Victor Harlan. Victor, his right-hand man, his fixer. The man who had been by his side since the beginning, since before Maxwell had a mansion, or an empire, or a name that made men flinch. Victor, who knew every secret, every account number, every buried body. "You're being paranoid," Maxwell muttered to himself. Santos didn't respond. Wise man, Maxwell picked up his phone and called the mansion. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. He called again. Same result. He tried Lily's personal cell. Nothing. He set the phone down slowly, deliberately, the way a man sets down a glass he's afraid he might shatter. "Santos," he said quietly, "take the back road. Servant's entrance." Santos adjusted course without a word. The mansion sat at the edge of a bluff overlooking the south side of the city, surrounded by iron gates, surveillance cameras, and enough security protocol to make a small country nervous. On any given night, Maxwell could pull into the main drive, be met by 2 guards, and walk through the front door to the smell of dinner and the sound of his wife's voice calling from somewhere in the upper rooms. Tonight, there were no guards at the servants' gate. Maxwell noticed it the moment Santos turned off the headlights and eased up the gravel path. He held up one hand. Santos stopped the car. "Wait here," Maxwell said. "Sir, wait, here." He slipped out of the car into the rain, Beretta in hand, moving low and fast toward the back entrance, the way a man moves when every instinct he has is screaming that something is wrong. The servant's door was unlocked. He eased it open, stepped inside. The kitchen was dim, lit only by the faint under-counter lights that Lily always kept on at night. The smell of coffee, old coffee hours old, hung in the air. A single mug sat on the counter, half empty. Maxwell moved through the kitchen, silently back pressed to the wall, scanning the room the way a soldier sweeps a building. His ears were tuned to everything. The hum of the refrigerator, the rain hammering the windows, the low, distant murmur of voices somewhere deeper in the house. Voices. He stopped, listened. Two voices, a man and a woman, too quiet to make out words. But the tone was wrong. It wasn't the flat professional cadence of a meeting. It wasn't tense. It was comfortable, easy, almost playful. Maxwell took one step toward the hallway. A figure stepped out of the shadows directly in front of him. He raised the Beretta in a single motion, thumb on the safety finger, curling toward the trigger, and froze. It was Isabelle. She stood maybe 4 feet in front of him, hands slightly raised, palms forward, eyes wide but steady. She was wearing her uniform, plain gray dress, dark apron, and her dark hair was pulled back tightly. She couldn't have been older than 30. In 2 years of working for him, she had been precisely what she appeared to be, quiet, efficient, invisible. But right now, looking down at the barrel of his gun, she was the most present person in the room. "Mr. Gray," she whispered, "please, stay silent." He stared at her. "What are you doing?" "I heard your car." Her voice was barely above a breath, but perfectly controlled. "You need to lower that gun and listen to me. You've got 3 seconds to tell me what's going on in my house." "They're in the living room," she said. "Mr. Harlan and Mrs. Gray." The words landed like a punch to the sternum. "Victor is here." It wasn't a question. "He's been here since 8. She didn't look away. "Mr. Gray, I need you to not go in there." As something shifted in Maxwell's chest, not fear, he hadn't felt fear in so long, he'd nearly forgotten its shape. This was something older. Something worse. The specific, nauseating dread of a man standing on the edge of something he cannot take back once he's seen it. "Step aside, Isabelle." "Please," her voice didn't rise, didn't crack. "If you walk in there right now, you will not walk back out." He lowered the gun by exactly 2 inches. "Talk." She talked fast. Her words were precise, organized as though she'd rehearsed them 100 times. She told him she'd overheard fragments conversations through doors, phone calls, in rooms she was supposed to be cleaning over the past 3 weeks. Pieces that hadn't made sense alone. Tonight they did. Victor had arrived at 8 o'clock with a bottle of Lily's favorite Bordeaux and a folder Maxwell had never seen. Isabelle had been clearing the upstairs hallway when she heard Lily laugh, a specific laugh, low and private, the kind she only made when she felt entirely safe, and the sound of it had made Isabelle stop dead and listen through the cracked door. "What did she say?" Maxwell asked. Isabelle hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "She said, 'Are you sure it worked?' And he said, 'By now it's done.'" The room tilted. Maxwell felt it physically, not the room, but something inside him shifting off its axis. He took one slow, measured breath. "His jet," he said, not a question. "Not yet," just a word placed carefully into the air between them. "Your jet," Isabelle said quietly, "your private jet, the one you were supposed to take home from New York." He had changed his plan last minute and driven. The decision had been impulsive, unlike him, completely unlike him, based on nothing more than a feeling. A pull, a bad note in the music. "Say it plain," he said. His voice had gone very quiet. The kind of quiet that people who knew Maxwell Gray understood meant something far more dangerous than shouting. Isabelle looked at him steadily. "I believe they tampered with the jet, Mr. Gray. I believe you were supposed to be on it." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Maxwell had ever heard. From the living room, he could hear it now. The voices clearer since he'd been standing still long enough for his pulse to stop ringing in his ears. Lily's voice, bright, warm, lit from within, saying something he couldn't quite catch. And Victor's answering laugh. Easy, relieved. The laugh of a man who believed his problem had been solved. Maxwell's hand tightened on the Beretta. 22 years. He had given Victor Harlan 22 years. had pulled him out of a two-room apartment in Pilsen when they were both 26 and nobody, had handed him power by the fistful, had trusted him with things that could have put both of them in a federal prison for the rest of their lives. And Lily, God Lily, 12 years of marriage. He had moved heaven and earth for that woman, had changed things for her that he'd never changed for anyone. He took one step toward the hallway. Mr. Gray, Isabelle's hand closed around his wrist. He stopped, turned, looked down at her hand, then at her face. Victor has 6 men outside, she said. I counted them when they arrived. They're positioned at the front, the east wing, and the driveway. If a shot is fired inside this house, any shot they will come in. You will not make it to the gate. He processed this. His mind was running cold and clean, now the way it always did when the emotion got too large and his survival instinct took over. He was calculating exits, timing, angles. He was, despite everything cracking open inside him, still Maxwell Gray. You counted his men, he said slowly. Yes. Why? She held his gaze. Because I knew this night was coming. That landed differently. He studied her face, the careful stillness of it, the way she met his eyes without performance or apology, and something shifted in his reading of her. Something he couldn't name yet. Who are you? He said. Right now, she said, I'm the person keeping you alive. Everything else can wait.
What?
He believed her. He couldn't have explained why exactly, except that in his experience, the people who lied to him were always slightly too smooth. They always gave him more than he asked for, filled the spaces too neatly, smiled in the wrong places. Isabelle gave him nothing extra, just what was necessary. Flat and clean and precise. He followed her. She led him back through the kitchen, past the cold coffee pot, to a door in the back wall that Maxwell knew was a utility closet. She opened it, stepped inside, and pressed on the left-hand panel. It swung inward. Behind it, a narrow passage, concrete walls, the smell of damp earth. Maxwell stared at it. I didn't know that was there. I found it 8 months ago, she said, while cleaning. He looked at her. 8 months. She'd found it 8 months ago and said nothing. He filed that away the way he filed everything, cleanly and without comment, and stepped through the door. The passage was barely wide enough for his shoulders. It sloped downward, curved left, opened eventually onto a steel door that Isabelle pushed open with both hands. Cold air hit them. They were outside on the hillside below the mansion's north wall, invisible from every security position he could name. He turned to face her the moment they were clear of the door. Where are we going? He asked. My car is 2 blocks north. She was already moving. I'll explain on the way. You'll explain now. She stopped, turned. In the rain and dark, she looked younger than he'd clocked her and somehow more tired, like a person carrying something very heavy for a very long time. My name isn't Isabelle, she said. It's Sophia. Sophia Valente. The name hit him like a fist. Valente. Carlo Valente. Maxwell had not heard that name spoken aloud in 7 years. Carlo Valente, who had built his own empire on the city's west side, who had been Maxwell's most dangerous rival for almost a decade, who had died in the Warehouse War of 2017, that had finally definitively settled the question of who controlled Chicago. The Warehouse War that Maxwell had started. The Warehouse War that Maxwell had won. Carlo Valente had a daughter. Maxwell had known that distantly, the way you know peripheral facts about a man you are at war with. A daughter, young, gone underground after Carlo died. Nobody had found her, and eventually nobody had looked. He stared at the woman in front of him. You came here to kill me, he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact placed between them. She held his gaze. Yes. But you didn't. No. Something moved across her face, not guilt exactly, more like the aftermath of a very long, very exhausting argument with herself. I didn't. Why? The rain was heavy now, soaking through his shirt, his hair. She stood in it without flinching. Because, she said carefully, I watched you for 2 years, Mr. Gray, and the man I watched wasn't the man who killed my father. Or rather, she paused. He wasn't only that man, and more importantly, I realized something about 3 months ago that changed everything. What did you realize? Her jaw set. Her eyes didn't waver. I realized, she said, that the man who actually got my father killed wasn't you. The ground shifted under his feet again, metaphorically, but the sensation was physical. He felt it in his knees. "Say that again," he said softly. "Victor Harlan fed your father intelligence," she said. "He made the war happen. He positioned both of you, you and my father, against each other so that one of you would eliminate the other and he would inherit the spoils. My father died. You won." Victor moved up. Maxwell stood very still. In the rain, in the dark, with the woman whose father he had killed standing 3 feet away from him, telling him that the man he'd trusted with his life had manufactured the reason for the killing. 22 years. And somewhere above them in the warm light of a house Maxwell had built with blood and iron and sacrificed, Victor Harlan was drinking good wine with Maxwell's wife and waiting for news that a plane had gone down. Maxwell Gray closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. When he opened them, something in his face had settled into something cold and permanent. "Where's your car?" he asked. "2 blocks north," Sophia said. "Then let's go," he said. "We have a lot of work to do." They moved fast through the dark and the rain. Sophia 2 steps ahead, Maxwell right behind her, the Beretta still in his hand, though he hadn't decided yet what he was going to do with it. His mind was running on 2 tracks simultaneously, the cold tactical one that was already mapping out what came next, and the other one, the human one, the one he'd spent 20 years trying to bury that was quietly coming apart at the seams. Victor Harlan. The name kept circling back like a bad song he couldn't shake. Victor, who had been his best man at his wedding. Victor, who had held Maxwell's hand in the hospital the night his mother died. Victor, who knew every account number, every offshore location, every name in the ledger that could bring the whole empire down in a single afternoon if handed to the right federal prosecutor. Maxwell's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. Sophia pushed through a gap in the iron fence at the property's north edge and kept moving. She moved well, not like a maid, not like a woman who'd spent 2 years folding linen and polishing silver. She moved like someone trained purposeful, like someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment for a very long time. "How long have you been planning this?" Maxwell said. Not accusatory, just needing the shape of things. "Planning to kill you." She didn't slow down. 4 years, planning to save you about 90 days. That's a narrow window. It was enough. They reached a side street, and Sophia walked directly to a gray Honda Civic parked tight against the curb, deliberately unremarkable, deliberately forgettable. Maxwell almost smiled despite himself. He'd have picked the same car. She unlocked it, slid into the driver's seat. He got in the passenger side, folding himself into a vehicle that was embarrassingly small for a man of his size. He hadn't sat in an economy car in 15 years. It felt almost absurd, the butcher of Chicago soaking wet, crammed into a Honda, with a woman who had come here to end him. She started the engine before her door was fully shut. "Where are we going?" he asked. "Safe house, 20 minutes. "Your safe house?" "Yes," he looked at her. "You understand how this looks from where I'm sitting." "You're sitting in my car instead of burning on a plane," she said flatly. "So maybe adjust your threat assessment." He said nothing. She pulled into traffic. The silence lasted about 4 minutes before Maxwell broke it, because Maxwell Gray had never in his life been able to sit with an unanswered question for longer than 4 minutes. "Tell me about Victor and my father," he said. "Not the version you gave me outside, the full version." Sophia's hand stayed steady on the wheel. "My father kept records," she said, "everything. He was obsessive about it, dates, names, payments, phone logs. He always said that paper was the only thing that never lied. A beat. When he died, I thought everything was gone. His office was burned. His right-hand man disappeared. I had nothing. But my father was paranoid in the specific way that kept him alive for 30 years. He had copies, 3 separate locations. One of them was a storage unit registered to a name I didn't even know until I was 25. She exhaled. "I found it 2 years ago, right before I came to work for you." Maxwell processed that. "What was in it?" "Everything," she said. "Correspondence between my father and someone he referred to only as the broker. Phone records, wire transfer confirmations. And one document," she paused. "One document that my father wrote himself by hand 3 weeks before he died. A record of every conversation he had with the broker over 18 months. And the broker was Victor." "The broker was Victor," she confirmed. "Victor, who was playing both sides. Feeding your father intelligence about my father's operations. feeding my father intelligence about yours, slowly escalating the tension between you, making sure neither of you could back down. She glanced at him briefly. He needed a war, and he needed one of you to win it so the other's territory would be absorbed and he would position himself as the indispensable man, the one who held it all together. Maxwell stared at the road ahead. He's been running this place since the beginning. Since before the beginning, Sophia said. Victor approached my father first, actually, 18 months before the war started. My father didn't fully trust him, but he used the intelligence. That was enough. The machine was already running. Maxwell's hands rested on his knees, perfectly still, but his mind was anything but. He was reconstructing the past 12 years of his life with a single new variable inserted and watching every major event reshape itself around it. The deals that had gone sideways, the rivals who had appeared at exactly the wrong moment, the federal investigation that had targeted Maxwell for 8 months before mysteriously collapsing, the investigation that Victor had claimed credit for dismantling. Had Victor been managing that too? Pointing it just close enough to keep Maxwell off balance, then pulling it back when it served him. He's been controlling everything, Maxwell said, and the words came out low and hollow. Sophia said nothing. She didn't need to. The safe house was a 2-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like old cooking and carpet cleaner. Plain walls, minimal furniture, a table with a laptop and a manila folder thick enough to be a small novel. Sophia locked the door behind them, shed her wet jacket, and went straight to the table. Maxwell stood in the center of the room and looked around. It was utterly nondescript and completely off-grid. No photographs, no mail, nothing traceable. He'd kept safe houses like this himself at various points. He recognized the discipline behind it. "You've been living here?" he asked. "Some nights." She opened the folder and pulled out a plastic sleeve of documents. "I need to show you something before you say another word about what to do next." "I already know what to do next." "You know what you want to do next," she said, looking up at him. "That's not the same thing. Sit down, Mr. Gray." He sat down, partly because she was right, partly because something about her directness. This woman who had walked into his house and into his life and dismantled it with surgical precision demanded a kind of respect he hadn't chosen to feel but felt anyway. She slid a document across the table. He looked at it. Wire transfers, a series of them spanning 8 months from an account in the Cayman Islands to a dummy corporation Maxwell recognized as one of Victor's. The amounts were substantial. Not suspicious on their face, Victor moved money constantly, legitimately as part of his role. But the source account, Maxwell leaned closer. The source account had a transaction code he recognized from a different context entirely. He looked up sharply. "That's DEFT, he said. Sophia nodded slowly. "Victor has been a confidential informant for the Drug Enforcement Administration for 6 years. The room went very quiet. Maxwell stood up from the table. He didn't do it dramatically. He just stood as though his body had decided it needed more space than a chair allowed. 6 years. Victor had been feeding information to federal agents for 6 years, which meant that every operation, every shipment, every meeting for 6 years had potentially been compromised. "How many people have I lost?" he said quietly. He was talking to himself more than to her, but she answered. 14 arrests that I can link directly to Victor's reports," she said. 3 of your men are currently in federal custody on charges that originated from intelligence he provided. There are 2 more that I believe were placed, not arrested, but placed. Put in positions where they became liabilities so you'd eliminate them yourself." Maxwell closed his eyes for 1 second. 2 of his men. Men he had personally, he stopped that thought before it finished forming. "Names," he said. "Danny Reese and Marcus Cole." The names hit him like cold water. Danny Reese, who had been his driver for 7 years before a shipment went wrong in a way that had looked at the time like Danny had talked. Maxwell hadn't killed him personally. He'd handed that to Victor. He saw now with horrible clarity exactly why Victor had volunteered so readily. And Marcus Cole, Marcus, who had been with Maxwell since the very first year, who had 3 kids, who Maxwell had convinced himself had been skimming, the evidence had been presented by Victor. Clean, irrefutable evidence. Victor had put that evidence together. Victor had also presented it. "He used me," Maxwell said. Each word was quiet and precisely spaced. "He used my own hands." Sophia looked at him steadily. "Yes, For 6 years, yes, the fury that moved through Maxwell Gray in that moment was not the hot explosive kind. He'd burned through that variety long ago in his 20s when he'd still had enough youth left to lose control. What moved through him now was colder and much more total. The kind of anger that doesn't dissipate, that converts instead into something clean and permanent and quietly devastating. He sat back down. He picked up the next document. He began to read. They worked through the folder for over an hour. Sophia had been thorough in a way that frankly stunned him, not because he'd underestimated her intelligence, but because what she'd assembled went far beyond what any single person working alone should have been able to compile. Bank records, surveillance photographs, transcripts of phone calls, a handwritten timeline going back 9 years. "Who helped you with this?" he asked at one point. She hesitated, just slightly. "A friend." "What kind of friend?" "The kind who doesn't exist on paper." He accepted that for now, filed it, returned to the documents. At the bottom of the stack, he found something that made him stop completely. A photograph. Grainy, taken from distance, but clear enough. It showed Victor Harlan standing outside a building Maxwell recognized, a federal courthouse in the Loop, shaking hands with a man in a gray suit. Maxwell didn't know the man in the suit, but he recognized the building, the angle, the year based on the seasonal trees in the background. And he recognized something else, the expression on Victor's face. Easy, relaxed, comfortable. The face of a man who had no fear. "When was this taken?" Maxwell asked. 7 months ago, Sophia said. 7 months ago, Maxwell had been deep in negotiations that could have exposed him to exactly the kind of federal scrutiny he'd spent decades avoiding. Victor had managed those negotiations. Victor had told him they were clean. Maxwell set the photograph down with extreme care. "He was going to let them take me," he said. "Eventually, yes," Sophia said, "but not yet. You were still useful. You still ran the day-to-day. The moment he had everything positioned..." She stopped, looked at him directly. The jet was the end game. Clean, untraceable, a mechanical failure on a private aircraft in bad weather. No body left to complicate things. No investigation with enough teeth to look closely. Victor inherits operational control, cite his grief, and within 6 months, everything runs through him officially. She paused. "Including a very generous settlement for your widow." The word widow hit the air between them like a stone dropped in still water. Maxwell sat with that, Lily. The woman he had built a life with, who had stood beside him through federal scrutiny and rival threats and years of living in the shadow of what he was. Lily, with her warm voice and her laughter that lit rooms, who had looked at Victor tonight with relief in her eyes. When had it started? Was it love or was it calculation? Had she sought Victor out? Or had Victor cultivated her the way he cultivated everything, patiently, methodically, playing the long game? Did it matter? Was she always part of this? He asked. His voice was very controlled. Sophia's expression shifted just slightly, just enough. "I don't believe she knew everything," she said carefully. "I think Victor told her what she needed to believe." "What did she need to believe?" A pause. "That you were going to destroy everything she cared about. That the federal attention was getting too close. That the only way out for her, for the life she wanted, was..." Sophia stopped. "Was me not being in it," Maxwell finished. Sophia said nothing. Maxwell stood again, walked to the window, looked out at the street below. Rain-slicked empty, a city going about its business entirely indifferent to the fact that his entire world had just been disassembled and laid out on a table. He'd been a hard man his whole life. He'd made hard choices and done hard things and had learned somewhere in his mid-30s to make peace with the weight of all of it. He wasn't built for softness. He'd known that since he was a kid in Bridgeport, watching his father move through the world like something sharp and purposeful. But this specific kind of pain had a different quality to it. Lily had looked at Victor tonight with relief. Not guilt, not conflict. Relief. He turned from the window. "What do you want out of this?" he asked Sophia. She looked at him without blinking. "I want Victor Harlan finished," she said. "Not arrested, not disgraced. Finished. He killed my father. He used you to do it. He used you again to kill men who trusted you. He has been the architect of every disaster in both our lives for the better part of a decade, and he has been doing it from the shadows while everyone else bleeds." Her voice stayed flat and even, but her eyes were burning. I want him to not exist anymore. And me, Maxwell said. After Victor, where do I fit in your plan? A long pause. Something shifted in her face, not vulnerability exactly, but the absence of the careful armor she'd been wearing. Honestly, she said, always. I don't know, she said. I came here to kill you. I stayed to save you. I'm improvising at this point. Despite everything, despite the night, the betrayal, the weight of Danny Reese's name sitting in his chest like a stone, Maxwell Gray almost laughed. It came out as something shorter, quieter, but it was real. That makes two of us, he said. He looked at her across the table. This woman who had infiltrated his house, learned his secrets, built a dossier that would take down his oldest friend, and still stood here talking to him with the calm directness of someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He thought about Vincent Marchetti. Go home to your wife. He thought about the feeling in the car, the bad note in the music. He thought about the jet sitting in a hangar somewhere with something wrong inside it that nobody would find until it was too late. He should have been dead tonight. He wasn't. And now he had a choice: run or reclaim. He pulled out the chair across from Sophia and sat down. He placed the Beretta on the table between them, not pointed, not threatening, just present, an acknowledgement. Tell me everything Victor doesn't know you know, he said, and then we're going to talk about how this ends. Sophia Valente looked at Maxwell Gray, the man who had killed her father, the man she had spent 4 years hating, the man she had just saved, and pulled her chair forward. It starts with the D handler, she said. His name is Carver, and he doesn't know everything Victor has told him is a lie. Maxwell leaned in. For the first time all night, the balance of power had shifted. Victor Harlan was sitting in a warm house drinking good wine, believing he had won. He had no idea that the man he'd tried to kill was 30 minutes away, very much alive, and had just found the one weapon that could destroy him completely. Carver's full name was Special Agent Thomas Carver, and according to Sophia, he was a 15-year DEA veteran who had built his entire career on the Chicago operation, the operation that Victor Harlan had been feeding for 6 of those 15 years. He was by all accounts a careful and intelligent man who believed he was running one of the most productive, confidential informant relationships in the agency's Midwest division. What he didn't know was that Victor had been curating what he shared. Every piece of intelligence Victor handed to Carver was selected with precision enough to make arrests enough to build trust, enough to make Carver believe he was getting the real picture. But never anything that touched the core. Never anything that exposed Victor's own operations. Never anything that pointed toward the man Victor was actually working for. Victor's been giving Carver enough to stay credible, Sophia said, spreading 3 documents across the table between them. But there are gaps. Carver is smart enough to sense them. He just doesn't have the evidence to challenge his own source. Maxwell studied the pages, phone logs mostly, a pattern of contact between a number he didn't recognize, Carver's Sophia confirmed, and a burner that cycled every 40 days. Victor's tradecraft was good. Maxwell could acknowledge that much even now, even with the particular fury of a man who had been systematically betrayed, sitting in his chest like a hot coal. What does Carver think Victor is? Maxwell asked. A disgruntled lieutenant with a conscience, Sophia said. Victor's cover story is that he's been cooperating because he wants out and can't find a clean exit. She almost smiled, and it wasn't a warm expression. Ironic given what he actually is. So if Carver finds out he's been played, Victor loses his protection overnight, Sophia said. Everything Victor handed to the DEA gets re-examined. The cases built on his intelligence get challenged, and Victor himself becomes the subject instead of the source. She tapped the phone logs. But we need more than circumstantial pattern gaps. We need something Carver can hold in his hands. Maxwell leaned back in his chair. His mind was moving fast the way it always moved in the moments before a decision, locked in rapid associative skipping, past the emotional noise and cutting straight to mechanics. Victor keeps his own records, he said. He always has. I thought it was professional habit. Turns out it was insurance. Sophia looked at him. Where his office, the one in the Merchandise Mart building, not the downtown suite. Everyone knows about the downtown suite. The Mart office is registered to a consulting company that doesn't exist. Maxwell paused. He thinks I don't know about it. He's been wrong about that for 4 years. The silence that followed had weight to it. You knew about the office and never moved on it, Sophia said slowly. I never had a reason to, Maxwell said. Victor was my man. I knew he kept things close to his chest. I respected it. I thought it was loyalty to his own survival, which is something I understand. A beat. I didn't know his survival plan involved my death. Sophia stared at him for a moment, not with judgment, but with something more complicated, almost with recognition. The specific expression of someone who understood exactly what it felt like to be betrayed by trust placed in the wrong person. Can you get into that office? She asked. Not directly, not tonight. Maxwell's jaw shifted. Victor will have people watching my known contacts within the hour. When the jet lands in New York and nobody can reach me, he's going to realize the play didn't work. He'll go into damage control immediately. How long before he figures out you're alive? 6 hours, maybe 8 if we're lucky. Maxwell looked at her. Who else knows you're here? Who knows you work for me? No one who matters. She hesitated. Except one. The friend who doesn't exist on paper. Yes. I need a name. Another pause. Shorter this time. Eddie Farrow. Maxwell went very still. Eddie Farrow is dead. I attended his funeral 4 years ago. Sophia held his gaze. Eddie Farrow attended his own funeral and found it quite instructive. Eddie Farrow had been in his previous life Maxwell Gray's best surveillance man, a compact, quietly brilliant former military intelligence officer who had a gift for disappearing in plain sight and an almost supernatural ability to read a room from 1,000 feet away. He had faked his death after a federal sweep got close enough to make staying alive more trouble than it was worth, and had been living under a different name in a 2-bedroom house in Evanston, doing private work for select clients. Sophia had found him 14 months ago. Eddie had agreed to help her because, as he explained when they arrived at his door at 2 in the morning, and he answered it in a bathrobe, looking entirely unsurprised to see them, he had his own unfinished business with Victor Harlan. Victor told you I was skimming, Maxwell said flatly, standing in Eddie's narrow hallway, while the man put coffee on, with the unhurried ease of someone who had anticipated this conversation. Victor presented evidence that I was cooperating with the feds, Eddie said from the kitchen, which was interesting since the only person I'd ever talked to about my federal contacts was Victor. He reappeared in the doorway. 2 days before the sweep, Victor suggested I take a long drive and not come back. I thought he was doing me a favor. Took me 8 months to understand what he was actually doing. Removing a resource you couldn't control, Maxwell said. Removing the one man in your organization who was good enough to eventually notice what Victor was doing, Eddie corrected. There's a difference. Maxwell absorbed this. Another name to add to the ledger. Another man Victor had shaped, redirected, eliminated, not with violence which left marks, but with information which left nothing but the damage. Can you get into the MART office? Maxwell asked. Eddie looked at him over the rim of his coffee mug. I've been in the MART office twice in the past 6 months, he said calmly. Building a full picture. I just didn't have enough to act on. He glanced at Sophia. Until now, I assume. Sophia nodded. Victor tampered with the jet. Eddie set down his mug. Then we're past the point of patience. He was already moving toward the back of the apartment. Give me 20 minutes. Maxwell sat at Eddie's kitchen table while Sophia stood by the window watching the street below with the focused stillness of someone who had been in precarious situations enough times that vigilance had become involuntary. Maxwell watched her without meaning to, cataloging details the way he cataloged everything. The way she checked the window at regular intervals, not random ones. The way she'd positioned herself at an angle that kept both the door and the window in peripheral view. You had combat training, he said. She didn't turn around. My father believed in it. Carlo didn't train his people like that. He trained his daughter like that. A pause. He was afraid, I think, that something would happen to him and I'd be left alone with no way to protect myself. She finally glanced at him. He was right to be afraid, just wrong about the timing. Maxwell found he had nothing adequate to say to that, so he said nothing. He was not a man who filled silences with noise. He sat with the weight of it, the specific grinding irony that Carlo Valente had trained his daughter to survive the world Maxwell represented, and that training had ultimately saved Maxwell's life. The world had a dark sense of humor. What are you going to do about Lily? Sophia asked. The question was direct, not unkind, just a thing that needed asking. Maxwell's hands rested flat on the table. I don't know yet. She believes you're dead. I know. Victor will move fast. If he thinks the jet worked, I know, Maxwell said again. Quieter. Let him move. Every move he makes in the next 8 hours thinking he's won is a move we can use against him. He looked at Sophia. When did she start Lily, I mean? When did she and Victor? I don't know the exact timeline, Sophia said carefully. What I can tell you is that 3 months ago, they were already using encrypted messaging through an app registered to a LLC in Delaware. She met his eyes. It wasn't recent, Mr. Gray. He nodded slowly. That was the thing about the truth. You could brace for it, and it still hit you. He had braced. It still hit him. He thought about the last 6 months with Lily, the way she'd seemed not distant exactly, but lighter somehow. He'd read it as contentment. He'd thought she'd finally settled into the life they had. He'd been glad for it. He'd been reading a performance. How long had she been performing? 1 year, 2? Had there been a specific moment when she looked at Victor and made a decision? Or had it been slower than that? A gradual tilting adrift so incremental that she hadn't even noticed it until she was already too far from shore to see the land. Did it matter? He pulled his mind back to the table, to the folder, to the concrete problem in front of him. Because that was how you survive things like this. You put the feeling in a box, and you put the box somewhere you could find it later, and you dealt with what was directly in front of you. It wasn't healthy. He knew that. He'd been doing it his whole life. It worked. Eddie returned in 18 minutes, not 20, carrying a laptop and a small hard drive. He sat down across from Maxwell, opened the laptop, and pulled up a directory of files. I have copies of everything Victor has in the Mart office, he said in the tone of a man discussing grocery lists. I've been copying incrementally over 6 months. The last pull was 11 days ago. Maxwell stared at him. You've had this for 6 months. I had pieces for 6 months. I didn't have the jet. I didn't have the DEA connection confirmed. I had enough to be suspicious, not enough to move without getting myself disappeared for real this time. Eddie opened a file. I also didn't have you. The words landed plainly and without sentiment. Maxwell looked at Eddie Farrow, a man he'd thought was dead, a man he had mourned quietly and genuinely in the way he allowed himself to mourn people, and felt something shift in the territory around his chest. Pull up the DEA material, Maxwell said. Eddie pulled it up. What they found in the next 40 minutes of reading was thorough enough to dismantle Victor Harlan from the inside out. Not just the DEA connection, though, that alone was devastating, but a parallel record Victor had kept for his own protection. Detailed notes on every piece of intelligence he'd fed to Carver. Dates, content, case outcomes. Cross-referenced against Maxwell's own operations, annotated with Victor's private assessments of what each disclosure cost Maxwell and gained Victor. It was, Maxwell realized with a nauseating kind of clarity, a masterwork. Years of careful, patient manipulation documented in Victor's own hand, in Victor's own files in an office Victor thought no one knew existed. He kept records of what he was doing to me, Maxwell said. He kept records of everything. Eddie said, that's who Victor is. He needed the documentation as leverage. If the DEA ever turned on him, he had proof of what they knew and when. If you ever came close to the truth, he had plausible deniability built into the framing. Eddie scrolled to a specific section. But here's the part that ends him. Maxwell leaned forward. It was a separate file, encrypted but cracked by Eddie over the past week. Inside it, communication records between Victor and someone identified only by a Chicago federal courthouse extension. Not Carver. Someone above Carver. Someone who had been feeding Victor advance warning of federal movements in exchange for Maxwell read it twice to be sure, in exchange for investment returns from a private fund that Victor administered. Victor wasn't just informing. Victor had a federal official in his pocket, a senior one. He's been running both ends, Maxwell said slowly. He's been running every end, Sophia said from across the table. Her voice was flat, but her eyes were alive. The DEA thinks they own him. You thought you owned him, and all this time, he's owned everyone. Not anymore, Maxwell said. He looked at Eddie. Can you get this to Carver directly, bypassing the normal channels? I can get it to Carver in a way that makes it impossible for it to be buried, Eddie said. But the timing matters. If Victor figures out you're alive before we move, then we move before he figures it out, Maxwell said. He checked the time. It was 3:47 in the morning. The New York meeting had ended at 9. The jet was supposed to have landed around midnight. Victor would have been waiting for confirmation of the crash. By now, he was likely still waiting. Mechanical failures on private aircraft sometimes weren't discovered until hours after. Victor was probably still in the mansion with Lily. Victor has a phone, Maxwell said. A specific phone, not the main one, black. He keeps it in an inside jacket pocket and never puts it down. That's the one he uses for the DEA contact and for whatever he has on the courthouse. He looked at Sophia. If we could get that phone, we wouldn't just have his records. We'd have active communications. Live proof. Getting close enough to Victor to take his phone means getting close enough to Victor's 6 men, Sophia said. Not necessarily, Maxwell said. Victor has a vulnerability. He's predictable in one specific way. He paused. Every morning at 6:30, regardless of what happened the night before, Victor runs. 4 miles, same road. He's done it for 15 years. He says it clears his head. Maxwell's expression was unreadable. He'll run tomorrow morning. He'll think he's won. He'll be relaxed. He'll have his main security team stand down. He always does on the morning run, says he doesn't want a parade. He runs alone, Eddie asked, with 1 man, rotate on a monthly schedule. Maxwell looked up. I know this month's man. Is he yours? Sophia asked carefully. He was, Maxwell said. Before tonight, I would have said absolutely. Now, he stopped. Ran a calculation. His name is Garrett. Been with me since year 4. Victor never bothered to cultivate Garrett because Garrett is not the kind of man who can be cultivated. He's straightforward in a way that makes him useless for manipulation. A beat, which makes him exactly the kind of man I can trust right now. You're going to contact him, Sophia said. I'm going to contact him in a way that doesn't trigger anything if his phone is being monitored. Maxwell looked at Eddie. Do you still have the old channel? Eddie looked at him steadily. The one you shut down in 2019. Yes. I kept a copy, Eddie said simply. Of course he had. The message went out at 4:15 in the morning through a communication protocol so old and so thoroughly abandoned that the likelihood of anyone monitoring it was functionally 0. It was 8 words. Maxwell composed them carefully, weighing each one. What came back 12 minutes later was 4 words. Where, when, I'm there. Maxwell exhaled. Something unknotted slightly in the region between his shoulder blades is the first real loosening of the night. Garrett, straightforward, unmanipulable, 20-year man Garrett, who had apparently heard about the jet, who had apparently had his own doubts, who had apparently been waiting for exactly this signal. 6:30, Maxwell said, looking at Sophia and Eddie. Victor's route takes him past the river at the 20-minute mark. That's the window. He stood up. We have less than 2 hours. I need a change of clothes, a clean phone, and whoever you trust most in this city besides the 2 people in this room. Eddie was already on his feet. I have 2 men, former military, no criminal record, no connection to you or Victor. I've used them before. Brief them, Maxwell said. Full picture. If they're in all the way. No half measures. Eddie nodded and moved to the back room. Sophia looked at Maxwell. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said, if this goes wrong at the river, it won't, he said. But if it does, Maxwell said, then at least Victor doesn't get to keep the narrative. He met her eyes. He doesn't get to be the man who killed Maxwell Gray in a plane crash and got away clean. Whatever happens tomorrow, that version of events dies at the river. Sophia held his gaze for a long moment. Something passed across her face, not quite trust, but the edge of it, the place where the decision to trust begins. My father would have hated this plan, she said. What would he have done instead? She almost smiled. Exactly the same thing. Maxwell Gray put on the clean jacket Eddie had left on the back of the chair, checked the Beretta one final time, and thought about Victor Harlan lacing up his running shoes in the gray light before dawn, unhurried, satisfied, completely certain that by now, somewhere over the dark Midwest sky, the problem named Maxwell Gray had already been solved. He thought about how profoundly wrong Victor was, and he walked toward the door. The Riverwalk was empty at 6:17 in the morning, the way Chicago is empty in those specific minutes before the city remembers itself and starts moving again. Maxwell positioned himself on the north side of the pedestrian bridge collar, up hands in the jacket pockets, looking for all the world like a man taking an early walk rather than a man who had been awake for 23 hours and was about to intercept the person who had tried to kill him. Sophia was 40 yards east on a bench near the water coffee cup in hand, dressed in civilian clothes, watching the approach path. Eddie's two men, Kowalski and a man who introduced himself simply as Price, were posted further back out of sight lines with clean phones and clear instructions. Eddie himself was in a car 3 blocks north, laptop open, running the file transfer to Carver that they'd been preparing since 5 in the morning. Time to execute the moment Maxwell sent a single word. Garrett was already at the bridge. He'd arrived 4 minutes early, which was very Garrett, a man who treated punctuality the way other men treated religion. He was standing at the east railing, wearing a gray track jacket, hands in his pockets, and when Maxwell came up beside him and stood there without announcing himself, Garrett turned and looked at him with an expression that contained exactly zero surprise. "You look like hell," Garrett said. "I feel like it," Maxwell said. Garrett turned back to the river. "I heard the jet had a mechanical issue. They were saying it turned around short of New York." A pause. "I didn't believe it." "No. Victor called me at midnight to ask if I'd heard from you." Garrett's jaw set. "Victor never calls me. We've worked side by side for 8 years, and that man has called me directly exactly twice. The first time was when your mother died." Another pause. "The fact that he called made me think you were probably fine." Maxwell looked at the man beside him, stocky gray at the temples, face that had absorbed a lot of weather over the years, and felt something in his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe. The specific kind that comes when a person turns out to be exactly who you thought they were at the moment you needed it most. "How much do you know?" Maxwell asked. "Enough to know I don't know everything," Garrett said. "Tell me the rest." Maxwell told him. Not everything. Not Sophia's full identity. Not the details of what was in Eddie's files. But the core of it, the Jet Victor's DEA connection, the courthouse contact, the 6 years of systematic betrayal. Garrett stood and listened without interrupting, without flinching, without performing the shock that a lesser man would have performed. When Maxwell finished, Garrett was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then he said very quietly, "Danny Reese." "Yes," Maxwell said. "And Marcus Cole." "Yes." Garrett's hands came out of his pockets and gripped the railing. His knuckles went white. "Danny had 3 kids," he said. "I know." "Marcus used to drive his mother to church every Sunday." Garrett. "I know." He released the railing to the Euroscene, took a breath. "I know, I just needed to say it out loud." He turned to face Maxwell directly. "What do you need from me?" "Victor is 2 minutes out," Maxwell said. "Yes." "He runs this path every morning. You're his designated security this month. When he comes around that corner, you're going to be exactly where he expects you to be, doing exactly what he expects you to be doing. The only thing that changes is what happens when he checks his phone." Garrett looked at him steadily. "And what happens when he checks his phone?" "He's going to get a message," Maxwell said, "from a number he'll recognize. And when he reads it, his face is going to tell us everything we need to know about what he's been doing." "What's the message?" Maxwell told him. Garrett's expression shifted into something that might on another occasion have been described as satisfaction. "Where will you be?" he asked. "Close enough," Maxwell said. He moved off the bridge before Garrett could say anything else. So, Victor Harlan arrived at 6:29, which was exactly on time, which was exactly Victor. He came around the curve in the path at an easy pace, not a young man's run, but the steady, controlled pace of someone who had been doing this long enough to make it efficient rather than effortful. Dark tracksuit, earbuds in one ear, the black phone clipped to his waistband. He spotted Garrett on the bridge and slowed to a walk, lifting a hand in acknowledgement. Maxwell watched from the recessed shelter of the North Bank angle oblique, close enough to read expressions. Victor reached Garrett and pulled out one earbud. They exchanged a few words Maxwell couldn't hear. Victor looked relaxed, satisfied. The body language of a man at the beginning of a very good day. He checked his regular phone once, a glance quick and habitual, and put it away. Then Garrett said something, short, deliberate. Victor's posture changed. Not dramatically, Victor was too controlled for dramatic. But Maxwell saw it. A slight straightening, a particular stillness, the kind that precedes an explosion of movement in either direction. Victor said something back. Garrett shook his head. Victor reached for the black phone. Maxwell was already moving. He came up from behind and to the left fast but not running, walking at the specific pace that eats distance without announcing itself. Victor had the black phone out and was staring at the screen with an expression Maxwell had never seen on that face before, unguarded and thoroughly afraid. The message Maxwell had sent from a number Victor would absolutely recognize, a number connected to a dead drop they'd shared since year one, contained 5 words. "I know, all of it." Victor looked up from the phone and Maxwell Gray was standing 3 feet in front of him. The color left Victor Harlan's face with startling speed. For a moment, just a moment, neither of them moved. 22 years of history compressed into the space between 2 men on a pedestrian bridge at 6:30 in the morning. Maxwell looked at the face he'd known longer than any other face in his adult life and felt something absolute settle over him. Not hatred, something colder and more final than hatred. "Max," Victor said, his voice almost held. Almost. "You tried to kill me," Maxwell said. Not accusatory, just a fact, placed on the table between them the way you place down something irretrievable. Victor's jaw moved. Something flickered across his face. Maxwell watched it and cataloged it with the detachment of a man who had already made his decisions and was now simply executing them. What flickered was not guilt, it was calculation. Even now, even caught, Victor's mind was already running angles. "I want you to hear me out," Victor said. "I've been hearing you for 22 years, Maxwell said. "I'm done listening. I want you to do something instead." He nodded at the black phone still in Victor's hand. "Call Lily." Victor stiffened. "What?" "Call her, right now. Tell her what happened. Tell her the jet didn't work." Maxwell's voice was steady. "I want to hear how that conversation goes." Victor." The single word landed with the weight of everything that had come before it. "Call her." Victor didn't call. What he did instead told Maxwell everything remaining that he needed to know. He ran. He was fast for his age, Maxwell would give him that. He went left off the bridge railing, hit the lower path at a pace that was fully committed, heading south toward the parking area where Maxwell had no doubt a car and a driver were waiting at a prearranged location for exactly this contingency. Victor had planned for this possibility too. Of course he had. Victor planned for everything. "Price," Maxwell said quietly. Price was already moving, having anticipated the break before Maxwell said a word. He cut the angle on the lower path with the efficient stride of a man who did this professionally and without drama. Victor got 40 yards before he realized the intercept was happening. He slid to a stop, looked back, looked forward, turned to check the bridge. Kowalski was behind him. Garrett was to his left, and Maxwell was walking down the path toward him at a pace that communicated with perfect clarity that there was absolutely nowhere left to go. Victor Harlan stood in the middle of the path with his 3 possible exits blocked and looked at Maxwell approaching and did something Maxwell had genuinely not predicted. He started to laugh. Not a breakdown laugh, not hysteria, a short, almost admiring sound, the laugh of a chess player who has watched his opponent find the one move he didn't see coming. "You found out about Eddie," Victor said. "Eddie sends his regards," Maxwell said. "How long?" "Long enough." Maxwell stopped 6 feet away. "The DEA files, the courthouse contact, the Valente correspondence." He paused. "All of it, Victor. In Carver's hands as of..." He checked the time. "About 11 minutes ago." Something moved through Victor's face then that was real. Not the calculation, not the performance, not the smooth professional armor that had kept him intact for 22 years. Something genuinely human and genuinely afraid cracking through the surface for the first time. He understood what Carver having those files meant, not just the end of his DEA protection, the reversal of it, the moment the asset becomes the subject. "You understand what happens now," Victor said. His voice had gone low. "You hand me to Carver, everything I gave him gets challenged. Cases get thrown. Your people get released, and then you're dealing with..." "My people are already being looked at by a lawyer Eddie retained at 5 this morning," Maxwell said. "Federal public defender backup filed at 6. We thought of that." He tilted his head. "Try another one." Victor's jaw worked. "The courthouse contact, if that comes out the way you think it does..." It'll take down a federal official who's been on your payroll for 6 years, Maxwell said. Yes, that's the point. It'll also set off a chain that brings scrutiny onto every Victor. Maxwell's voice cut through the air with a quietness that stopped the other man mid-sentence. I'm not interested in your threat assessment. I spent 22 years trusting your threat assessments, and I now know precisely what they were worth. He stepped forward one pace. I want to ask you one question, and I want you to tell me the truth. Not because the truth changes anything for you at this point, but because I need to hear it from your mouth. Victor looked at him. Something in his posture had changed the last of the fight going out of it, the shoulders settling into something that was not quite defeat, but was very close to it. What's the question? He said. Carlo Valente, Maxwell said. Did you know what would happen to him when you set it in motion? The pause that followed lasted exactly long enough to answer the question before Victor spoke. I knew one of you wouldn't survive it, Victor said. That's not what I asked. Another pause, shorter. Victor looked away from Maxwell for the first time since they'd been face to face on the bridge. He looked at the river, at the pale morning light on the water at some point in the middle distance that seemed to require his attention. Yes, he said quietly. I knew. Maxwell held the silence for 3 seconds, long enough to let it mean something. Thank you, he said. Then he stepped aside and nodded to Price. Damn. Sophia was at the car when they came back up. She looked at Victor, hand-secured expression carefully blank, already retreating behind whatever final wall of composure he'd constructed, and said nothing. But her eyes moved from Victor to Maxwell and back, and what Maxwell caught in them was not the fire of revenge satisfied. It was something more complicated, the particular expression of someone who has arrived at the thing they spent years chasing and found it smaller than the shape it had taken in their head. He understood that. Are you all right, he said quietly, coming up beside her, while Garrett and Price managed Victor toward the second car. I thought I'd feel different, she said. Different how? She shook her head slowly. Better. A pause. Or worse, maybe, something bigger. She watched Victor being guided into the back seat. He looks like an old man. He is an old man, Maxwell said. He's an old man who made choices that I spent 22 years calling loyalty. He looked at her. What he did to your father that doesn't shrink, Sophia. Don't let this moment make you think it shrinks. She turned to look at him, and in her face he could see the daughter of Carlo Valente and the woman who'd infiltrated his household, and the person who'd made a different choice on the night that had been designed to be the last night of his life, all at once, layered over each other. What happens to him now, she asked. Carver will have his files by the time Victor's lawyer here starts making calls, Maxwell said. The DEA will want to talk to him. The federal prosecutors will want to talk to him even more. The courthouse contacts people will be very motivated to distance themselves, which will only dig the hole deeper. He paused. Victor will spend every remaining year of his life answering for things he thought were perfectly buried. And the courthouse official, that one I'm giving to a journalist, Maxwell said. Eddie has a contact, someone credible who's been watching that building for 2 years and just needed the thread. A slight pause. Sometimes the cleanest ending isn't the violent one. Sophia looked at him for a long moment. My father would have disagreed with you. Your father is why I know it's true, Maxwell said. That landed between them with a weight that neither of them reached for immediately. She turned back to the view and he stood beside her, and for a moment they were just two people in the early morning, with the city waking up around them carrying the specific exhaustion of people who have been fighting something enormous for a very long time. Then Maxwell's clean phone buzzed. He looked at it. One message. Lily's name on the screen. He stared at it long enough that Sophia noticed. You don't have to answer that, she said. I know. He looked at the screen a moment longer. Then he put the phone in his pocket unanswered and looked at Sophia. There are still 6 men at the mansion who answer to Victor. By noon today, they will know that Victor has been detained and that their operational authority has dissolved. I need to be the person who tells them not because I want to, but because the man who tells them first controls what happens next. Sophia turned fully toward him. You're going back. I'm going back, he said. It's still my house. Lily is in that house. I know. Maxwell. She used his first name for the first time. He noticed. are you sure you're ready for that conversation? He thought about it honestly. The way she'd laughed last night with Victor's voice woven through hers, warm and careless. The 12 years of what he'd believed to be a life they were building together. The performance of it, running underneath everything invisible until it wasn't. Was he ready? No, he said. But I'm going to have it anyway. He started walking toward the car, then stopped, turned back. Come with me, he said. Sophia looked at him. Why, boss? Because you know more about what happened inside that house than I do, he said. Because you were there for 2 years and I need someone I can trust beside me when I walk back in. He held her gaze. And because I think you've been alone with this for long enough. Something moved across Sofia Valente's face. Not the armor, not the calculation, not the careful stillness she had worn like a second skin for the entire night. Something underneath all of that. Something that looked in the pale morning light like a person finally setting down a weight they'd been carrying so long, they'd forgotten it wasn't part of them. She walked to the car. They drove in silence for the first few minutes, the city scrolling past the windows, ordinary and indifferent. Maxwell watched his phone in his jacket pocket without taking it out. Lily's unanswered message sitting there, waiting. Then Garrett from the driver's seat said quietly, "There's something you should know before we get there, boss." Maxwell looked up. "What?" Garrett's eyes stayed on the road. "I got a message from Paulo. He's on the night security rotation at the mansion about 20 minutes ago, before you came back from the bridge." A pause. "He says Mrs. Gray left at 6 o'clock this morning." The car went very quiet. "She left," Maxwell said. "Yes, sir." "Alone?" "No." Another pause. "Paulo says she had 2 suitcases and she left in a car he didn't recognize." Garrett's voice was careful and even delivering the information the way a good man delivers bad news cleanly, without embellishment, without the cruelty of excessive detail. He tried to call Mr. Harlan to report it, couldn't reach him. Maxwell sat with that information for a quiet moment. Lily hadn't waited for confirmation of the crash. She hadn't waited for a phone call, for a news report, for any official word. She had packed 2 suitcases in the night and driven away from a house she'd lived in for 12 years at 6 o'clock on a rainy morning, as though she had been ready for a very long time and was simply waiting for permission to leave. Maxwell said nothing. Sophia, sitting beside him, said nothing either, but she reached across and briefly, just once, pressed her hand over his. Not a gesture of romance, not even quite of comfort, just the acknowledgement of one person to another that something real had happened, and it hurt in the way real things hurt, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. He let it sit for 3 seconds. Then he straightened. "Does Paulo still have his post?" he said. "Yes, sir." "Tell him to stay there. Tell him I'm 20 minutes out and I want the full security roster assembled in the front room when I arrive." Maxwell's voice was back, not cold exactly, but clear. The voice of a man who had made peace with what could not be changed and was focused entirely on what could. "And Garrett?" "Yes, sir." "Thank you for this morning, for all of it." Garrett met his eyes briefly in the rearview mirror. 20 years, he said simply. 20 years, Maxwell agreed. The car moved through the city, and Maxwell Gray sat straight in the back seat with his hands resting on his knees, and his mind already 3 moves ahead, and somewhere on the far side of all the wreckage of the past 12 hours, the shape of what came next was beginning to clarify into something he recognized. Not redemption. He'd never been that kind of man, and he wasn't about to pretend otherwise. Not exactly justice either, though it was closer to that. Something more like reclamation. The act of looking at everything that had been taken, everything that had been built on a lie, and deciding deliberately with full knowledge of the cost that it was still yours, that you were still standing, that the story wasn't over simply because someone had tried to write the ending without you. He thought about Victor's face on the bridge, the moment the armor had come off. He thought about Sophia's hand over his. He thought about Lily's empty house and 2 suitcases and a door closing at 6 in the morning. He put his hand in his pocket, felt the phone, left it there. The mansion came into view as they turned the last corner, and Maxwell Gray looked at it the way you look at something you've nearly lost with new eyes, and something harder and quieter than love, and the absolute unshakable intention of a man who has survived the night and knows exactly what that means. He opened the car door before Garrett had fully stopped. He walked toward the front entrance without hesitating. And behind him, after a single second's pause, he heard Sophia's door open and her footsteps fall into pace beside his. Paulo was standing at the front entrance when Maxwell walked through the door, and the look on the man's face said everything before either of them spoke a word. Paulo had been on the mansion's security rotation for 6 years, a quiet, broad-shouldered man from Bridgeport who had never once been late, never once asked for more than he was given, and never once looked at Maxwell with anything other than the straightforward reliability of someone who had decided a long time ago where his loyalty lived. Right now, he looked like a man who had been awake all night carrying something too heavy to put down. "Mr. Gray," Paulo said, and then stopped. "Because what do you say to a man you believed was dead 12 hours ago, who is now standing in front of you looking like he's been through a war, which he has the roster," Maxwell said. "Tell me who's here." Paulo ran it fast. 8 men on the overnight rotation. 6 of Victor's imports, the same 6 Sophia had counted the previous evening, who had, as of 40 minutes ago, received no communication from Victor, and were beginning, Paulo said, to look at each other in a way that made Paulo nervous. 2 of Maxwell's original security team, who had been on the back perimeter through the night and who Paulo had personally kept away from Victor's men during the hours when the situation was still unclear. "Where are Victor's men right now?" Maxwell asked. "Front sitting room," Paulo said. "I told them Mr. Harlan had been delayed and asked them to wait. They've been waiting 40 minutes. A pause. "They're starting to ask questions I don't have answers to." "I have the answers," Maxwell said. He looked at Sophia, who gave him a single nod, then at Garrett, who had come in behind them and positioned himself at Maxwell's right shoulder with the automatic, wordless efficiency of a man who had done exactly this, stood beside Maxwell Gray, in rooms that were about to get difficult more times than either of them could count. "Let's go." He walked into the front sitting room, and the 6 men inside it looked up simultaneously, and what happened in the next 3 seconds was something Maxwell had witnessed before in various forms, but never quite got used to: the specific cascading reaction of people confronted with something they had been told was impossible. 2 of them stood. One knocked his coffee off the armrest and didn't appear to notice. One reached toward his jacket before stopping himself, reading the room fast enough to understand that the reach would be the worst decision of his morning. Maxwell stood in the center of the room and looked at each of them in turn. Unhurried, deliberate, letting the silence do the first 30 seconds of work. Then he said, "Victor Harlan is in federal custody. He was taken at 6:47 this morning under a DEA detainment order based on evidence of 6 years of confidential informant activity, deliberate intelligence manipulation, and the bribery of a federal courthouse official." He paused. "Your employment contract was with Victor, not with this organization. That contract is now void." Another pause. "You have one decision to make, and you have about 30 seconds to make it. You can walk out that door, get in whatever car Victor arranged for you, and drive back to wherever you came from. No one will stop you. No one will follow you." His voice stayed absolutely level. "Or you can do something stupid, in which case I will guarantee that every federal detail currently being assembled around Victor Harlan's name will include yours as well." The room was very still. The man who'd reached for his jacket put both hands flat on his thighs. 27 seconds later, all 6 of them were walking out the front door. Garrett watched them go and exhaled through his nose. "That was cleaner than I expected." "Victor hired professionals," Maxwell said. "Professionals understand when the math has changed." He turned to Paulo. "Get me coffee, and then I need 20 minutes alone in the East Study." The East Study had been Maxwell's father's room before it was his, a small book-lined space that smelled faintly of old wood and the particular mustiness of a room that holds more history than it releases. Maxwell sat at the desk and stared at his phone for a long moment before he finally opened Lily's message. It was short, 3 sentences. "I know you're alive. Victor called me at 6 and told me something went wrong. I'm not coming back, Maxwell. I think we both know why." He read it 3 times. Not because it was complicated, it wasn't. It was possibly the clearest thing Lily had said to him in years, which was its own specific kind of irony. He read it 3 times because he was giving himself exactly this much time to feel it fully before he put it in the box. She wasn't coming back. He sat with that. The 12 years. The house they'd built together, the decisions he'd made that he'd told himself were partly for her. The version of himself he'd believed existed in her eyes. All of it. He sat with it for the full 20 minutes he'd asked for, and he didn't perform composure, and he didn't perform grief. He just sat in his father's chair in his father's room and felt the full weight of the thing and let it be what it was. When he came out, Sophia was in the hallway. She looked at his face and didn't ask. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For giving me the room." She nodded once. "There's a development," she said. "Eddie called. Carver has been in contact." Maxwell straightened. "How fast?" "Fast," she said. Carver confirmed receipt of the files at 6:43. By 7:15, he had a supervisor involved. Eddie says there's already a second team being pulled in, not just DEA federal prosecutors. She paused. "And Carver wants to talk to you." "Of course he does." Eddie says it's not a trap. Carver's institutional interest right now is in validating the evidence and building the case against Victor and the courthouse official. You're a witness to Victor's operational activities, not the primary target of this investigation. She met his eyes. "At least for now." Maxwell heard the qualification. "At least for now," he repeated. "Carver is a pragmatist," Sophia said. "He'll take what he can get in the order that serves him best. Right now, what serves him best is Victor. After that," she left it open. "After that is a different conversation for a different day," Maxwell said. He moved toward the kitchen, needing the coffee Paulo had promised and hadn't yet delivered. Set the call with Carver for 10 o'clock. "I want Eddie on the line and I want a lawyer present. Not my usual lawyer. He's connected to too many things. Do you have someone?" "I have someone," Sophia said without hesitation. He glanced at her. "The friend who doesn't exist on paper. The friend has several friends. I'm beginning to think your network is better than mine. I've had fewer people trying to destroy it from the inside," she said simply. He almost laughed, again, for the second time in 24 hours. He was beginning to think that was her specific talent, finding the one true sentence in the middle of catastrophe and saying it out loud without ceremony. The call with Carver happened at 10:03, and it was every bit as careful and complicated as Maxwell had expected. Carver was professional, precise, and very clearly running the conversation on two tracks simultaneously, the official one building his evidentiary record, and the personal one, which was the track of a man who had been played by a source he'd trusted for 6 years and was working very hard to keep his humiliation from showing. Maxwell gave him what he needed: the operational confirmation of Victor's access, the context for the DEA intelligence gaps, the timeline of Victor's internal positioning within the organization. He gave it cleanly and without elaboration, the way a man gives testimony when he has a lawyer present and a very clear understanding of where his lines are. Carver listened, asked questions, listened more, and then near the end of the call said something that made the room go quiet. "Mr. Gray," Carver said, "I'm going to be straightforward with you." "I'd appreciate it," Maxwell said. "The federal prosecutor on this case is going to want to talk to you about broader organizational matters. That conversation will happen eventually. What I can tell you is that the active cooperation you have provided this morning and the evidence package that accompanied it will be part of the record that prosecutor reviews before that conversation begins." A pause. "I can't make you promises I'm not authorized to make. What I can tell you is that the man who handed us 6 years of buried federal corruption is not the same as the man we might have been looking at yesterday." Maxwell looked at his lawyer across the table. The lawyer, a compact, silver-haired woman named Frances, who had arrived at 9:45 and said nothing unnecessary before the call and nothing unnecessary during it, gave him a slight nod. "I understand," Maxwell said. "Good," Carver said. "We'll be in touch." The call ended. The room held its breath for a moment. Frances put down her pen. "That was as good an outcome as this call could have produced," she said crisply. "Don't mistake it for safety, but it is a foundation." "I know the difference," Maxwell said. "Good." She gathered her papers. "I'll have a formal memo to you by end of day outlining your exposure and the parameters we're working within. Don't talk to anyone about this without me present." She looked at him steadily. "And Mr. Gray, the next 60 days are going to be the most important 60 days of your professional life. Whatever you do, do it carefully." She left. The room let out a collective breath that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite anything else. Eddie's voice came through the laptop speaker. He was still remote, still 3 blocks north, still careful. "For what it's worth," Eddie said, "I've been waiting 6 years to make that call. It felt good." "Go home, Eddie," Maxwell said. "Get some sleep. I'll sleep when this is actually over. It's over enough for today." A pause. "Yeah," Eddie said. "I guess it is." Another pause shorter. "It's good to talk to you, boss. I mean that." Maxwell looked at the laptop screen, Eddie's face slightly pixelated, tired and real, and unmistakably alive. "It's good to talk to you too," he said. "We'll figure out the rest." By noon, the story had broken. Not the full story, not yet, but the thread of it. A federal official in the Chicago courthouse had been taken in for questioning in connection with an ongoing DEA investigation. By 1:30, a second thread, a named confidential informant had been arrested and was cooperating. The name was held from the initial reports, but the details were specific enough that anyone who knew the shape of Chicago's underworld would begin to connect them almost immediately. Maxwell's phone ran hot for 2 hours. He answered none of it. He sat in the kitchen with Sophia and Garrett and Paulo and Francis's memo, going through it section by section with the methodical focus of a man who understood that the war wasn't over. It had simply moved to different ground. The violence was done. The real battle now was legal, organizational, and slow, and it would require a different kind of endurance than any he had exercised in the past 24 hours. Garrett left it too, with a handshake that lasted slightly longer than handshakes usually do, and a look that said everything the handshake didn't. Paulo went back to his post. Francis called at 3 with a preliminary read that was cautiously optimistic and heavily qualified, the way good legal advice always is. And then it was just Maxwell and Sophia in the kitchen, where it had all started and ended and started again, with the coffee that Paulo had finally made sitting between them on the counter and the afternoon light coming through windows that neither of them was looking at. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Not today, after." Maxwell considered the question, not the organizational answer he had that already assembling itself in the back of his mind, the series of moves and adjustments and restructurings that would need to happen in the coming weeks and months. He considered the human answer, which was harder. "I don't know exactly," he said. "Rebuild some things, dismantle others." He looked at his coffee. "Figure out what I actually want, which is something I haven't done honestly in probably 15 years. That's a big project." "I know." He looked up at her. "What about you?" Sophia was quiet for a moment, her hands wrapped around her mug. In the afternoon light, she looked neither like the maid who had stood down the barrel of his gun 24 hours ago, nor like the woman who had dismantled his world with a folder of documents. She looked like herself, whoever that was, underneath all the plans and the patience and the 4 years of hunting something that had turned out to be more complicated than a target. "I came here for one thing," she said. "I don't have that thing anymore. I have," she paused. "I have my father's files. I have the record of what actually happened to him. I have the truth, which is something I didn't have before." She looked at him steadily. "I don't know yet if that's enough, but it's more than I had." "It's not nothing," Maxwell said. "No," she agreed, "it's not nothing." "Will you stay in Chicago?" A pause longer than the others. "For a while," she said carefully. "There are things that aren't finished here." She held his gaze. "For both of us." Maxwell nodded slowly. He understood what she meant and what she didn't say, and he found somewhat to his own surprise that he was not uncomfortable with either. There was something between them that had no clean name yet, not friendship exactly, not alliance exactly, something forged in the specific furnace of the previous night that had its own category and its own weight. He trusted her in the very specific, bone-deep way that he trusted almost no one, built not on history, but on evidence and on the choices she'd made when the choices were real. She had saved his life, not because she had to, not because it served her, because she had looked at the truth of what had happened and chosen something different than what she'd come here for. That meant something. It meant a considerable amount. His phone buzzed. He looked at it, a number he didn't recognize, then a text from Eddie. "That's Francis. She says turn on channel 7. He turned on the small television on the kitchen counter. A press conference. The Chicago field office of the DAE flanked by federal prosecutors standing in front of a cluster of microphones. The lead prosecutor, young Sharp, clearly very aware of the cameras, was confirming the arrest of a federal courthouse official on charges of bribery and corruption connected to a broader investigation into organized crime intelligence operations. She used the phrase systematic betrayal of public trust twice. She did not say Victor Harlan's name. She didn't need to. Sophia watched the television without speaking. Maxwell watched her watch it. There was a particular quality to her stillness, not the controlled tactical stillness of the previous night, but something quieter. The stillness of someone watching a long chapter close. The press conference ended. Maxwell turned the television off. "He'll deal," Sophia said. "Victor, he'll give them everything he has to cut his sentence." "Yes," Maxwell said. "Does that bother you?" "What bothers me," Maxwell said slowly, "is that he'll spend the rest of his life in a room making deals, which is what he's always done. That's not justice, that's just Victor being Victor in a smaller space." He paused. "But it's the world we operate in, and I'll take it over the alternative." Sophia turned to look at him. "What was the alternative?" "The bridge this morning," Maxwell said simply. "I had the Beretta, I had 6 feet of distance, and no witnesses except men who would have stayed quiet." He held her gaze. "I made a choice." She was quiet for a long moment. "Why?" "Because," Maxwell said, "I've been the man who ends things with a gun for 22 years. And it hasn't made anything better, not once, not ever." He set down his coffee cup. "I'm tired of being that man." Something shifted in Sofia Valente's face, something that moved all the way through it, not just on the surface. She looked at Maxwell Gray, the butcher of Chicago, the man who had killed her father, the man who had almost died the night before, and had walked back from it with his hands clean and his choices deliberate, and whatever had been left of the 4-year story she'd written about who he was dissolved quietly in the afternoon light. "My father would have said you went soft," she said. "Your father was wrong about a lot of things," Maxwell said. "He was also right about a lot of things, like keeping records." He paused. "Like training his daughter." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away, and the corner of her mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. "What do we do now?" she asked. Maxwell Gray looked around the kitchen, his kitchen in his house, in the city he had built himself into through blood and intelligence and the specific kind of stubborn refusal to stay down that had defined him since before he had anything worth protecting. He thought about Garrett's 20 years. He thought about Eddie's face on a laptop screen, tired and alive. He thought about Francis's memo, the legal architecture of what came next. He thought about Victor in a federal holding room, running the angles, still calculating, unable to stop. He thought about Lily's 2 suitcases and a door closing at 6 in the morning, and he placed that carefully finally in the box where it belonged. And then he looked at Sofia Valente, who had come here to end him, and had instead, through some combination of conscience and intelligence and the specific courage it takes to change your mind about the most important decision of your life, given him back something he hadn't known he'd lost. "We start over," he said. "Both of us, from here." Sofia Valente looked at him for a long, clear moment. Then she picked up her coffee, held it toward him once in the smallest and most unperformed of gestures, and said, "From here." Maxwell Gray picked up his own cup, touched it to hers, and for the first time in 22 years, the man they called the Butcher of Chicago allowed himself to believe that the story he was living was not yet done, and that the next chapter, built on truth instead of blood and chosen instead of inherited, might be the one that finally meant something worth leaving behind.